Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jacinta Weiss. I'm the coordinator of the Gawler Cultural Heritage Centre. Welcome. In welcoming you here tonight, we'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. We pay our respects to Kaurna elders past and present, and we acknowledge the ongoing connection of the Kaurna people to their country. Just some housekeeping before we start. The bathrooms are at the end of the corridor. We will be filming this session tonight. There will be a Q&A at the end, and we'll have speakers, microphones for that. If you'd like to announce your name before you ask your question, you please feel free. If you just want to ask the question, there's no need to identify yourselves. So our format for this evening, we are going to talk briefly about our project to digitise Patterns in Perpetuity, Rob's book. Then Rob's going to speak, then Nicolette's going to speak, and then we will have a discussion and questions, hopefully a lively and interesting reflection on our current state, where we believe we should be, and what we can do about that as participants in community life. So to start, the project to digitise Patterns in Perpetuity. In 2024, Adrian Shackley, on behalf of the Gawler Environment and Heritage Association, approached the Cultural Heritage Centre about the possible digitisation of Patterns in Perpetuity by Rob Cheeseman. From the outset, we recognised this as an important project because it would ensure that one of South Australia's most significant works on planning history and urban design could be preserved and made accessible for future generations. We were delighted when Rob generously agreed to allow the book to be digitised, and we're excited to work with him to make it freely available through the Cultural Heritage Centre's electronic catalogue. The book was originally published in 1986 from an original research dissertation that Rob submitted to Cambridge University in 1976. Patterns in Perpetuity explores, among other things, the planning principles behind Colonel William Light's design for Adelaide and examines how thoughtful urban planning can balance development, green space and long-term economic sustainability. Decades after its publication, the work continues to influence discussions about heritage, planning and the protection of Adelaide's unique character. By digitising the book, the project has removed barriers to access for researchers, students, historians and members of the community. Many important local history publications exist only in limited print runs and can become increasingly difficult to obtain over time. Digitisation not only protects the works from their physical deterioration, but it also ensures that the ideas that they contain remain part of contemporary conversations about heritage and urban development. So this project is significant because Patterns in Perpetuity is regarded as an influential contribution to the understanding of Adelaide's planning history. Rob's work has been referenced in heritage studies, academic research, and discussions surrounding the Adelaide Parklands and colonial town plan. By preserving and promoting the book, the Cultural Heritage Centre has reinforced our role as a custodian of regional history and a place where important historical ideas can continue to inform public discussion. Importantly, the digitisation project reflects the broader mission of the Gawler Cultural Heritage Centre to connect the community with stories, research and collections that shape South Australia's identity, safeguard knowledge and encourage civic discussion, and ensuring that future generations can engage with the enduring legacy of thoughtful planning and heritage conservation. The process of digitising material was far more complex than many people might imagine. It's often assumed that digitisation simply means scanning papers and running them through an OCR software before publishing the results online. In reality, the process was meticulous and time-consuming. Virtually every page required reformatting, and the many graphs and images had to be carefully reinstated from primary sources to ensure the necessary resolution and quality. I would particularly like to acknowledge the role of Petra Brown, the Heritage Research and Collections Officer at the Cultural Heritage Centre. Petra dedicated countless hours to reformatting the scanned pages and worked closely with Rob to ensure the accuracy and integrity of the final publication. I think it would be fair to say that they both enjoyed some spirited discussions along the way, particularly about aspects of language, punctuation, and some of the book's more distinctive grammatical quirks. So our heartfelt thanks to Petra for working through this project and ensuring that we had a quality outcome that we can now present to the community that they can read at any time they wish on their digital devices. So today we celebrate not only the digitisation of an important publication, but also the collaboration, expertise and shared commitment that made this project possible. Projects like this demonstrate the value of preserving our intellectual and cultural heritage and remind us that the ideas of the past still have much to contribute to the future. We are proud that Patterns in Perpetuity can now be accessed freely by anyone with an interest in history, planning and the enduring vision that helped shape South Australia. So we'll encourage you, after we're finished tonight, to scan the QR codes so you'll have quick and easy access to Patterns in Perpetuity, but for anyone else that you might be talking to, it's available on the Gawler Cultural Heritage Centre's eHive electronic catalogue. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Rob Cheeseman, AM, author of Patterns in Perpetuity and a passionate advocate for heritage planning and the enduring vision of Colonel William Light. Rob's career as an architect has spanned more than 50 years. He is the founder of Cheeseman Architects and a former lecturer at the University of Adelaide School of Architecture and Built Environment. Since its publication in 1986, Patterns in Perpetuity has become an influential and widely respected contribution to discussions about Adelaide's planning history, the protection of the parklands, and the importance of thoughtful urban design. Rob's work challenged people to think carefully about the relationship between development, public space, and the long-term character of our city, issues that remain just as relevant today as they were 40 years ago. What makes Rob's work particularly remarkable is the depth of research and conviction behind it. His writing reflects not only a deep understanding of planning history, but also a genuine belief that heritage and good design matter because they shape the way communities connect and thrive. We are incredibly grateful to Rob for his generosity in allowing the Gawler Cultural Heritage Centre to digitise Patterns in Perpetuity and make it freely accessible to the community. Through this project, a new generation of readers will be able to engage with his ideas and appreciate the enduring legacy and relevance of Colonel Light's vision for South Australia. Please welcome me and join Rob.
Too much.
It's been a pleasure to work with you.
This is a bit daunting because Petra, who is sitting in the audience, Petra, she's hidden. My son's gone. Petra could do this talk better than I could. She knows every word of this work. And not only that, as she's been through it, she's dived into the internet and questioned some of my statements and etc. And in that regard, she's been fantastic. We've had the introduction, how this happened. I just have to say that Petra's devotion to this, while she's been doing building work at home with a builder that was never going to finish, and managed the children, and done the housework, and been in the cultural centre most of the time, typing this out. And she's still sane, I think. She's had Jacinta to refer to, and Adrian Shackley looking over his shoulders. I have to say thank you very much to you two guys. But I'm totally floored by the cultural centre here and your interest in heritage and what you are doing for Gawler. I do have an affinity here. My grandfather and grandmother were married here, probably in about 1895 or so. Her grandmother's father was a Deland. They owned the mill. My grandfather came from Kapunda. He was a church organist. And they went on down to Adelaide, and the rest is history. Okay, I'm going to read a statement first. I call this a retrospective. The release online of this edition of Maps in Perpetuity responds to an urgent and renewed interest in urban parkland idea and the containment of cities. The exponentially increasing attrition of open space beyond the urban fringe has negated the idea of planned urban containment with open space. Sprawl has continued unchecked to the detriment of agriculture, agricultural land, open space and natural environments. That William Light's unique plan for Adelaide successfully integrated Wakefield and Bentham's economic parameters is well established. That the Adelaide plan was later adapted and applied to solve at first for a town called Letchworth in Great Britain in 1911, and the subsequent growth of Greater London in the mid to latter 20th century has been demonstrated. With the wasteful destruction of essential open space, our democracies have failed to plan our cities as healthy, contained urban environments. We've allowed our land valuation systems to ignore good social and physical urban planning. In the hands of weak government, the highest and best use axiom has dictated the ultimate takeover of parkland, agricultural land and natural environments. After Adelaide, William Light planned the new town of Gawler in 1839. We could have a discussion about that for an hour, but that's every corner here I can get sidetracked. In South Australia, commissioned by private enterprise and conceived by Light et al., including Finnis, with topographical and environmental sensitivity, Light's plan for Gawler also included the parkland containment idea. Today, Gawler hangs onto its parklands and rural fringe by a thread. Successive South Australian governments have permitted broadacre residential development unchecked, smothering its surrounding rural lands with sprawling dormitory housing. Cheek by jowl, these developments have raised the cost of living while inducing flood, urban heat sinks, and extreme social, economic and environmental consequences. The 1962 Metropolitan Adelaide Plan by Stuart Hart presented in part an effective solution for urban growth for the future without sprawl. Yet it was largely overlooked by governments successively, all influenced by land speculators. Hart's plan was to depend in part on government, land banking, and consistent planning system, one that you can trust. But both have yielded to private demand. This book reminds us that the urban sprawl phenomenon has been upon us for more than 150 years, yet we continue to ignore the consequences. These consequences are the direct outcome of short-term political blindness under the influence of the pecuniary returns from land speculation abetted by land valuation systems. I did have this written here, but I thought you'd be distracted while I was reading it, so it's best it's not there. And that's the thank you to Senator Petra and Andrew. So this story, for me, hangs around four names. A bloke called Jeremy Bentham, who died in about 1832. Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who you've all heard of, a social economist. Bentham, of course, was a socialist. Wellington, that is Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, and William Light. The result of those four people, with others, resulted in what we now call Adelaide. It is unique in the world, and it is unique not just because of the design of the city, but the whole of the city, of which the parklands were an integral part. So we know that image. You can tell when that image was taken, probably somewhere between Bannon and Rand's governments, because between that time we got the Grand Prix. We didn't have at that stage the Adelaide Oval. We didn't have all this stuff happening here, and hospital, I could go on. Total madness. So, excuse me. The value of Adelaide's parklands, retained agricultural land and broad open space. We can read this. The value of the city of Adelaide's town acres, I'll have to turn this a bit, was established almost solely by the containing parklands. So Bentham met with Wakefield in about 1831, I think, and originated the idea of containment for a city or a town. Bentham called this his vicinity maximising and dispersion prevention principle of development. Very neat statement for containing a town. This was an economic model. This is not to do with defence. This is an economic model which said we can use the open space to grow the value of the contained town acres. Light's plan remains a world first. This is the Light Wakefield plan, first in the world. I haven't seen anywhere else where it's been repeated so successfully. So under the influence of broadacre developments, governments have ignored this and gone on to destroy the parklands, spoil the city, as you all know. There we are. Fling on here and out it goes. Now, if I'd listened to Petra, I'd have the proper plan here, which she's reminded me of, which is in the back corner of the room here. It's the 1st of July 1839 plan for Gormal signed off by Finnis and Co, Light, Finnis and Co. But it's a very special, for me, a very special plan, which I'll talk about a bit further on. That plan, of course, is now buried, just like Adelaide, with the North and South Parra rivers. It's buried in this growth that's happening. Where does it end? And of course, this is what we call planning now. Certain people can go to the government with something they draw which describes a half a section or a section of country acres, and with political persuasion and maybe other stuff here, they can actually start to subdivide and say they have a plan. But this plan has got nothing to do with this or anything anywhere else. It's totally out of context. There's a total failure centrally within South Australia and everywhere else in Australia to create the context for this to happen. This is cynical. Chainsaw, golf, Grand Prix, 38-storey building, a hospital and another hospital, Adelaide Oval, and one day it'll be gone. Well, we heard last week that the brewery site's going to be allowed to grow from 7 stories to 14 stories. I don't have a problem with that. But count the people, count the backyards that they don't have, and create a backyard for them as a community backyard. So we should be growing the open space, not eating it. Michael Williams, I put a lot of store in back in the 1950s and 60s at Adelaide University. Michael was a geographer. He's now moved on. Wrote a couple of books. This one was called Making of the South Australian Landscape. Another one was called South Australia from the Air. Michael Williams, and I'll show you later on in the slide, showed us that we had some 350 parkland towns in South Australian Northern Territory based on the plan for Adelaide. That's all recorded in South Australia from the end. So Light's physical plan is unique. It successfully incorporates the Bentham-Wakefield principles. Did Light design it? No. It's an adaptation of a topical model. His physical 1839 plan for Gawler, I think, is further expression of his influence, but his influence, as we see in Adelaide, and I'll talk about that if I've got time, is really to do with taking a topical model and adapting it to the landscape. So he had this sort of topographical and landscape sensitivity that I've not seen in any other historical planner. So Adelaide then was the primary antecedent for Goyder's model plans for South Australia. Goyder was the Surveyor General around 1860, and for much of the British new town planning of the 19th and 20th century. In fact, the 1948 British New Towns Planning Act virtually takes what Adelaide is in form, and that becomes a prescriptor for new towns in Britain. So the 1, 2, 3 generations of new towns, some 40 new towns over post-Second World War, and I believe Adelaide and Light and Bentham and Wakefield were the people who influenced that. Adelaide, in my view, is World Heritage. I think Gawler could be too. The importance of Gawler and Adelaide plans, and to a lesser extent Elizabeth, have been largely overlooked. So it's interesting that Elizabeth was designed, came out of Playford and out at Ramsey, 1948 Housing Trust, but in fact was right at the beginning of the first of the British New Towns. And there are a lot of principles in Elizabeth that came out of that New Towns Act, Great Britain. Here are the players. I think Napier, who was to be South Australia's first governor, referred to the Duke of Wellington as old bonehead. I find it interesting to look at the age of these people. Here we've got Light, came here when he's 50 years of age, died when he's 53. So in 1836, Wakefield was about 40. Jeremy Bentham just died in his 80s. And Wellington was, what's that, 50, 60 something. Interesting characters, all with a history of their own. And that's a whole other area of history that we could sidetrack that. This man, of course, was notorious because he took up with an underage girl. He ended up in jail for that. And he wrote his book, Systematic Colonisation, while he was in jail. If we want dirt, William Light was married with 2 children, and his wife endured Light being looked after by their housekeeper, Mariah Gandy. When Light came to Australia, of course, he came on the rapid with Mariah Gandy and left his wife and children behind. The fact that he was born in Penang illegitimately, all of these things played against Light being believable at the time, and hence his trouble with High March. Now I'm just going to skip through a few precedents for Adelaide. In 1610 or thereabouts, the English had successfully taken control of Scotland, taken control of Wales. They built castles and walled castles and walled towns. I cover this in the book. But then they experimented, they went overseas to Ireland. So the first invasion offshore for England was to Ireland. That was before North America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand. They settled very quickly, and to settle they had to have plans. The towns were all planned, in this case by a chap called Nicholas Pinner, in the army. He was probably Sandhurst. The houses were built very quickly. They went across the sea, they were prefabricated. They were ahead of IKEA. They were flat pack houses. And in fact, we got flat pack houses here. I don't know if you've seen the Manning House on Pennington Terrace in Adelaide. That was our first flat pack house. Nicolette knows about this. I find this interesting looking at this plan and looking at the plan of Gawler. You know, a square doesn't need to be a square. In Ireland, they call them diamonds. Don't know why, but they did. So Coleraine and Londonderry, and Light actually spent time in Londonderry. When they successfully subdued Ireland, they tripped over, the English tripped over to North America. And I think one of the early starts was the Pilgrim Fathers. Harvard was laid out, New Haven was laid out in about 1620 or 30 or so. And in Canada, they were starting to settle Canada. And quite quickly we see this idea of town acres surrounded by park land or plots surrounded by agricultural land. So the idea is taking form. And I'm only following an English avenue where you could go to France or Spain and find similar avenues of evolution. And then it happened that this is the St. Lawrence Seaway. Montreal is somewhere here. That's the Ottawa River. Ottawa is somewhere here. And for the settlement of Canada, we see all of these Dorchester plans with town acres, parklands, central square, farmland around it. Of course, these subdivisions were opportunised by property developers or land speculators. So the plans that were posted in Fleet Street, people bought lots off the plan and they never went there. So there's a bit of a problem because these towns that are there don't exist today. I've been there, driven along the whole area. They don't exist. So it was a sort of a Ponzi scheme where the developers got their money, stayed in London, and the silly people that bought the lots went out there and found there was no town and no economy. So while so we're dealing here with up to 1789, and we see the epitome of this with a plan for Toronto in Canada by a chap called Gautam Mann, 1788. The Trouving squares, 5 squares, town acres, common land, country sections. This is Lake Ontario. These are the islands here off Lake Ontario. It's a fascinating story. This is a picture of Mann. In fact, if any of you are old enough to remember Sir James Irwin, he's a descendant of Gautam Mann. Just another little coincidence. This never happened, didn't go ahead. Wonderful plan. And I think Mann's plan was very interesting because he was a friend of the Duke of Wellington, and it was Wellington that got behind the South Australian Company and the founding of Adelaide and the settlement of Adelaide. I'm quite convinced that through this history, and there's more of it in my book, that the precedent of this being the way to do a new town in the colonies was the way to go. So my view is that Light came to Adelaide with that plan in his head. Because he'd been sent here by Wellington, he knew Wellington. But while that was going on, this bloke Wakefield decided to, after his talk with Bentham, to set up his idea of systematic colonisation. The value of the land will increase more rapidly where population is concentrated. It will affect the proper division of labour. Professionals, skilled workers and merchants will have ample scope for their talents, etc. But the main principle here was that the town acres had to be contained. There could be no absentee landlords. You had to come to Australia to buy the land. You had to pay for the land. You couldn't buy 2 blocks of land side by side. You had to get your number out of a hat to buy the first acre. And then when your number came out, you could buy another acre. So you couldn't actually accumulate and monopolise certain parts of the city. So these principles were really well founded. But the most important thing is, as we know in basic economics, if you limit the supply and you talk up the demand, the price or the value goes up. So here's Adelaide, no reason at all to exist economically, is given value by virtue of the parklands and the Wakefield system, or the Wakefield-Bentham system of settlement. So I skip over a whole lot and get to William Light coming to here, South Australia, on the brink, the Rapid. There's the Rapid riding out a storm at Rapid Bay, just off Rapid Head. The head is just in the haze here behind. That's a sketch done by Light. How did he get there? Well, the first idea was that Napier should be the governor of South Australia. Napier insisted that he needed an army to come with him to subdue the natives. They refused him to have an army because they'd already set out the principles for settlement in terms of the natives, etc. So Napier said, well, I won't take the job. Who do you recommend? Well, there's a good bloke in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean with High Marsh. His name is Light. He'd be perfect for the job of governor. When the invitation came to Light, High Marsh, of course, intercepted it. Light received the information with the invitation, and High Marsh made sure he got the job. And he then was generous enough to suggest that Light should be his Surveyor General. Therein lay the beginning of the argument where Light said to High Marsh, mate, you can be the governor, but I've been engaged by the South Australian Commissioners. I will do what they want me to do. You do your job as governor. So, in 3 months he sailed here. High Marsh took 6 or 7 months to get here, leaving at the same time, because he was whining and dining and letting people know who he was on the way. I had to come in and get on with the job. So it just floors me when I look at this stuff. And, you know, here we are at Rapid Bay, here's Second Valley, here's the Second Valley. This is the Yankalilla River, that's the Bungala. Then he skips a beat all the way down here, gets the Onkaparinga. Somebody here knows, missed the Onkaparinga. But he's sketching it all the way down. And look at this beautiful sketch. There's Rapid Head coming right back to Carratalinga. The whole of that coastline sketched from the ship. Here he is up in Mangrove Creek. When he's here, High Marsh gets here and says, well, I think the capital should be Victor Harbour. Encounter Bay, it's called, as we know. Light said, that's ridiculous. Read Flinders' journals. No, it's in High Marsh, go down there and prove it. So this is Light's handwriting, angrily scrawled across a sketch he did of Encounter Bay saying why it shouldn't be the capital. What a waste of time to have to go and prove it yourself. That happened also for him with Port Lincoln, and in both cases, High Marsh had already purchased land in those places before he I'm very anxious to move on this thing. Where am I? Spoiled it. Okay. So Light ends up at Holdfast Bay, has a look up the river here, calls it Port Misery. And in fact, his very first sketch for a settlement is right where Hamilton's wines were on the foothills of at Seacliff. He hadn't even been to the high ground over here. This sketch, he casually drew a canal right across the wetlands at the back of the dunes, all the way to the north arm of the Port River. I just love these notes. I haven't got time to read these notes to you here, but every note that he writes just tells you how fast he worked and how quickly he assessed the value of the land. While he was doing that, this is what I believe was in his head. Here's the plan for Toronto in an idealised form. When Kingston probably took him up to the high ground, which we now call Adelaide, which was not flood prone, obviously if you've got a river, you've got to split it either side, particularly if you've only got enough land. He's got to fit 1,000 acres on more or less flat land. And it works out quite conveniently. 300 acres. Here's the Vitruvian plan that we call. Light did not design this, he did not design this, but he broke this up and then made it fit the landscape and the landform. I could go back and go into mathematics and take it back to your school days. How many chains in an acre, how many yards in a chain? 22. How many chains in an acre? How many square chains in an acre? 484. I think it was at 4,840. I can't remember. And you go through all this stuff, and you get back to the plan for Adelaide, and you see a town acre. A town acre, okay. An acre is how many? What's the green chain there? 484, isn't it? But you can't get a square root of whatever. I think you end up the side of an acre is 69.7655 recurring or something. It's a really weird thing to draw an acre and then try to draw a square which contains an acre. Anyway, I'm digressing, but so here's the plan suddenly starting to appear on the high ground with all the notes justifying why it should be there. This is his plan, it's his drawing, all in the Mortlock Library if you want to come find it. And there's the final plan. Is there a problem with this plan? Yeah, one or two. As we know, the landform here does this, so there was flooding down here just as in Gawler. I think they found there's flooding across Murray Street. That was one of the big early problems. And here are the players again. And this sneaky little bugger down here called George Strickland Kingston, a drunkard who variously called himself Irishman, variously called himself a surveyor, an architect and an engineer, did the dirty on Light, undermined him, sided with Hindmarsh. Eventually Hindmarsh was withdrawn. Light and Finnis and Jacob all left the surveyor's office and formed their own practice. And then we got Gawler out of that practice. This keeps jumping so fast. So there's the plan, and it's held good all through to the day. Step down the side here, the Green Hill Creek comes through into the Torrens. But if we read the principles that were established for light, and if Kingston hadn't gotten away, and if Hindmarsh hadn't wanted the change survey to be enacted effectively to speed up the whole surveying process, light would have taken much longer. And I believe all of the creeks and the torrents and all of the drainage lines across the plain would have had parkland or open space at least 50 metres either side. There's no question about it. It was all written there. That was what he was to do. And so today, I remember as a kid shooting rabbits and wondering why a fence went across a gully, and Dad would say, oh, that's the section line. Well, what's the section line? Oh, well, that's where the survey went. But it went straight across a cliff. Well, that's all right, that's how they did it. So, when I look at this plan for Gawler, the tragic story, like with tuberculosis, that plan backdated 1st of July 1839. Light's virtually crippled. He's on his bed. He's already been out here with Finnis and had a look at the site. He's realised as ever that the city or town needs to be built on high ground because he has this thing about flooding, which he had a huge argument with Hamish about for the floodplains. And he must have sketched this out. Whether that final drawing was done by Finnis, it probably was, or even by Jacob. Remember at the time Light was 53, Jacob was 24, Finnis was about 42 years of age, so you can see the age differences in these people. But he sketched it out and he signed it off on his deathbed. And the rest is history. Finnis saw the job through. Jacob probably did the pegging. There's a bit of a debate about that. Some people think Jacob actually did the whole job, but I don't think so. That's a very later picture of Jacob, not a 24-year-old. But when I look at this, I see, going back to Londonderry, Coleraine, this little sort of Irish influence. And if Light hadn't been given that Toronto, as I call it, model plan, would he really have done that? Well, I don't think so. I think he would have done squares, he would have had parks, but it would have been much more organic in its form. I've had a lot of information from the Finnis family. I got to speak a number of times with Harold Finnis before he died at 90 in the 70s. Keith Borrow, another descendant of the Finnis family, gave me a lot of their stuff to look at and read. The history is still here, and even the other day, John Mayo, descendant of George Mayo, presented a book about the Mayo family. George Mayo came out after Light as a doctor, surgeon, and he looked after Light. He was Light's doctor, but he took a shine to Mariah, so when Light died, George Mayo was on one side and Mariah was on the other side. And then Light was taken out, and not long after that, Mariah and George were living together, so that's all good. So the Mayo family and the Simpson family, those are all descendants of Gandhi. So I think that's about as much time. No, I've got a bit more. We're running over time. The continuing influence, George Goyder line. George was a Surveyor General in the 1860s. He said, well, we need to have more towns in the country. This is how you do a town. It's sort of square like this. It's got parklands around it. It's got country sections. If it's got a railway line through it, well, then there's a railway line. If it's a river, have a river through it. If it's on the coast, like Edithburgh, it's a half a town. And this is Michael Williams' dotting of all of the parklands, according to George Goyder. And in fact, they go into the Northern Territory, 350 odd. It's an extraordinary history, unprecedented in the history of the world of planning, colonial planning, and the settlement history in the world. Then, of course, this bloke, Ebenezer Howe, came along in 1890, and he had his ideas for settlement. He said, look, the only way to solve the terrible problems in Britain, the industrial problems, is to build new towns, and to build them with parklands, and to separate some of the residential areas from the main city area. In fact, then you can move out over the whole countryside with satellite towns. So the whole satellite town idea grew. And he then engaged with a guy called Roman Umland, an architect, in about 1910, or earlier, 1904, I got there, to plan the first experimental new town in Britain. It's called Letchworth. Some of you probably have been to Letchworth. Coincidentally, the Pix book runs through here, the residential area on this side, the city centre here. It's got a bit of Houseman's Parisian emphasis to it, but the parklands all the way around. All the areas in the acreage is virtually identical to Adelaide. That then becomes the model in terms of town containing open space, etc., for the whole of the British New Town system. Umland then goes on and does his model for satellite growth. Yes, dormitory residential area is not very good. And we got a planner from New Zealand called Charles Reed in 1919, or he came in about 1914. He was a fanatic, and he led the charge with his plan for Kilmalite Gardens. Again, espousing all the principles that have been behind the settlement of South Australia. He designed the Cadbury new town in just near Hobart, and he went from there. From Adelaide, he went to Ipoh in Malaysia and became the planner up there in the state of Ipoh for 3 or 4 years, and then went to Africa and did the same thing again. So we've got a QR code. This is the reference to the book. I'm absolutely delighted that the Cultural Heritage Group here, with initial guidance from Adrian, have allowed this to happen, because I just want the story to get to the world without people having to buy it in a bookshop. It's for free, it's for anyone that wants it. They can plagiarise it as much as they like it. I absolutely love it. That's the story really, guys. The big question at the end is, what are we going to do? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. It's now my pleasure to introduce Nicolette Delernia, whose work and advocacy have made an important contribution to heritage planning and the preservation of South Australians' cultural identity. Nicolette is also an architect of more than 25 years' experience and was the South Australian Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Architects for many years. Of course, her current role is with the National Trust as their CEO. Nicolette is widely respected for her deep knowledge of Adelaide's history and built environment, and for her commitment to ensuring that heritage remains an active and valued part of contemporary community life. Through her work, she has helped foster greater public understanding of the importance of thoughtful planning, conservation, and the protection of places and stories that define our state. Her passion for heritage is matched by a strong belief in community engagement, and the idea that history should not be simply preserved, but shared and discussed and made accessible for future generations. This makes her a particularly fitting contributor tonight and to our ongoing conversations surrounding Colonel Light's legacy and vision. So, please join me in welcoming Nicolette.
It's cooked up, as Rob said, in a prison by somebody who's been a little bit of a naughty boy. But he gets thinking about the situations that he knows about in the UK at the time, and also about the way in which colonisation has been and settlement has been happening in various parts of the world. He writes a rather interesting letter called The Letter from Sydney, which I about how difficult and how disorganised the settlement of colonies in Southeast Australia has been, how much land speculation has impacted the orderly growth of those communities, and he thinks, people can do better. So he makes this plan for systematic colonisation that thinks about people's way of life, encourages people to come out as family units, not just as random individuals, and which gives them some degree of certainty when they arrive. And that's pretty revolutionary for the time. So, in partnership with those underlying sort of socio-economic principles, we get Light's contribution, which is to enact this idea of a surveyed town with a balance of a contained city centre that focuses growth and provides a hub for urban development, and the corresponding rural acres which allow the colony to actually feed itself. And this idea, this very generous idea at the time of public open space, compared to the norm in a lot of European cities where there were open spaces, but only if you were the right sort of person and lived in the right sort of place. So we start off with this, this sort of hub and spoke kind of development for the state. We have a concentrated centre where the majority of the people in the development happen, but quite quickly we get this disbursement of communities out from that central point. People are attracted by resources, by farming, by all sorts of things to go out. It must have been an enormous adventure. You look at some of the places where people develop. There's a place that we stumbled upon in the far northern part of the Flinders called Nuckalina Mine. And a bloke who was out there, had come from Cornwall and was a shepherd at the time. I think he was lame as well, just to make life even more difficult for himself. Thought he found what looked like good all-bearing rock, and for about 10-15 years they mined copper at Nuckalina. It's in the middle of nowhere. Makes Burrow look like an inner suburb. But anyway, that sense of adventure and people going out and actually forming these quite early and quite concentrated communities. You needed to have everything you needed in your place. You could have a connection back to Adelaide or other centres in order to get things that you didn't produce in your own place, but it was a very traditional settlement pattern. And then we start to see the filling in of bits between the dots of concentrated settlement. So farming communities, and we've got farming happening in quite inner what we now consider suburban areas of Adelaide until well after the Second World War. People didn't just naturally fill up all of the bits, and until people got the chance to have a high degree of private car ownership, people relied on public transport and they needed to be near their places of work. And so you see all sorts of interesting things happening in the development of Adelaide at that point as well, and communities across the state. People came to the street that I now live in Woodward. I think half a Greek village moved in after World War II. The house we live in was the house where the lady opposite us, where her husband grew up, and where her sister-in-law Athena, who's just up the road, where she grew up. And Ilya is the son of the people who came from the same part of Greece and settled next door. It was people came and they worked out where they were going to work and they lived close by. It was a very organic and quite self-sustaining community. So you got these very strong communities building up because people needed to be in their place. You only travelled if you were doing it for your work. If you were a tinker or a shepherd or somebody who needed to move, or because you had money. And then finally we get to what we do today, which is just this disgorging of open tract housing across the landscape with very little regard for topography, for environmental conditions, for connectivity, and we get what we have today, which is a huge problem with urban heat, with traffic congestion, with social isolation and an epidemic of loneliness, which is fascinating, isn't it? We have bigger and bigger houses on smaller and smaller blocks, we have less connection with nature, we spend less time outside interacting with our community, and we now have an epidemic of loneliness. And we're gobbling up green space and agricultural land at an alarming rate. So we have this really solid basis for the development and settlement in South Australia. We started off with a really great set of principles. They allowed us to be a very innovative and quite exciting community for a long time. We had a lot of firsts in South Australia, and I'd like to think that the way in which we settled the place and the type of people who were attracted to that religious and social freedom that came with the settlement ethos allowed us to be quite progressive. We keep doing plans. So I spent the last 10 years being the director of the South Australian Institute of Architects. So that allowed me to be quite heavily involved in the development of the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act and the state planning policies that underpinned that. And we did a lot of feedback and consultation around the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan, or South Australian according to GARP, as I like to call it. And there are lots of good principles in these documents, really wonderful principles based on really strong research. We know that the biggest growing demographic in households across Australia is single-person households. We know at the same time that we have on average the biggest houses in the world. Our houses by square metre rates are bigger than those in America on average. These two things don't add up. We end up with people like my mum and my mother-in-law living in 4-bedroom houses on quarter-acre blocks in suburban Adelaide. And yes, they're ageing in place, but is it healthy and is it functional? And I would say no. So we know that we are planning for, and it's very aspirational, we pick the highest number of, or the highest expected population growth that we're saying we need to supply land for another 670,000 people over the next 30 years. That is the absolute upper limit of their projections. And we need to construct 315,000 additional homes to accommodate these people. So we're expecting slightly over 2 people per dwelling. And I look at the dwellings that a lot of my kids who are in their early to mid-20s, some of their slightly older friends are out there buying houses at the moment. And they're buying 4-bedroom, 2 living area, 5-bathroom homes as their first home. And then we talk about housing affordability and supply. Why can't we build more homes? Well, because they're bigger than they've ever been, and if you build one house that's 270 square metres instead of one house that's 90 square metres, which is what we had on average in the 1950s for a household with a higher number of people per household, then of course you're only going to be building one of those instead of 3 of the 90 square metre ones. I was very proud of my son and his girlfriend. They've just bought a 2-bedroom unit. Close to the tram line, close to where they work. Too close to us, but we have to put lock on the pan. Anyway, so we have these things that come out of some of the planning documents that we are using now, that we are applying right now. And it talks about really good things. Walkability and active travel, affordable living. Active travel means getting on your bike, literally. Open space and recreation, having an active lifestyle. Housing housing choices so that people like my mum and my mother-in-law aren't rattling around in 4-bedroom homes by themselves. My mother-in-law hasn't left her house for probably 3 years, unless it's to go to the doctor. People come to her, and she's lucky that they keep coming to her, but it's not a healthy life. So we need a sense of community, we need that because otherwise we're going to keep having this epidemic of loneliness. We need safer streets and spaces, local job options. Gone are the days when half the Greek village emigrated to Australia and they all got a job at the local concrete works, and so they all chose to live in the same street. My dad's family, they were from Italy, they did the same thing. They came and lived in a little tiny cottage in the western part of the city where the post office depot is now. Kennard's Hire, I think it is now. And on that street, I remember as a very little girl, you could go there and people were out on the street talking and swapping vegetables, and my aunt and uncle lived just down the road in a little tiny two-room, not 2-bedroom, 2-room cottage. And my dad thought it was Christmas when he arrived in 1960. It was the first time since he was 9 that he hadn't lived in a tent or a single room that he couldn't afford to run heating or lighting. Post-war Italy was a very glamorous place, and he was in the north. He wasn't in the impoverished south. He had a job and he was working in Genoa. He could afford 2 meals a day in a basic room. So, so we've got these great principles. And we talk about the importance of community and how important that is for us as a society, for our well-being, for our ability to take care of those who need support, for our for our health. And we understand the value of heritage. There's a great guy whose name is his last name is really tricky. Repekma. He's from the US. They have slightly different economic structures and planning structures in the US, but his research is an economist, and he looks at the impact of putting heritage protections and character protections on urban areas. And the work that he does demonstrates very clearly that in America, if you live in an area that has a high degree of heritage protection, you have a more diverse community. You have much less social isolation. You have better retention of property values. And you have a much healthier community. Because older, finer-grained areas, rather than the suburban sprawl that we do as an almost default position now in Australia, is actually much better for us as humans. That finer-grained, older, more traditional development structure also means that we have a post office, a hairdresser, a chemist, a medical centre, a hardware store, an IGA, something that we can probably walk to if we really want to. And again, that was another big factor for us choosing where we were going to move to when we decided to move house. And we moved to Goodwood because we can walk to the shops, and we can walk to the tram, and we can walk and have coffee and cake and a meal and see the doctor and go to the post office. We don't have to be car reliant anymore. My mum thinks that is outrageously, scandalously daring. She grew up without having a car at her disposal 24/7. But at age 85, she's finding that very confronting. And we have these, opportunities to have, this is it's old ash, so it's, very leafy and autumnal, but, it's the principle behind it that makes, we love those sorts of things when we go on holiday. We come home and we drive in and we open our automatic gates and we go into our drive into our garage and we close the thing and the door comes down automatically and we go into our house and we haven't even stepped outside. And as humans, that's really bad for us. We need the microbes in the soil and the plants to actually make ourselves healthy humans. It helps our mental health and it helps our physical health. We know the value of integrated transport. We know that we're basically killing ourselves with our dependence on cars. It makes us unfit, it makes us unhealthy, and it pollutes our world. And okay, electric cars are all very wonderful, but we're not quite there yet. And if the electric car and the electric caravan means that actually they're so big and heavy that the amount of effort you take to tow your caravan, which is fully electric, means that you have to have a Ram diesel dual cab ute. To take it anywhere, have you achieved anything? Active lifestyle. So how do we promote active lifestyles? We give people somewhere to walk, we give people somewhere to meet, we give them things to do, we make sure that there are reasons to be outside. And when I visit my dad's family in Italy, they don't live in a particularly glamorous part of the area between Rome and the sea, and kind of near Anzio. And it's Mussolini era 1930s New Town, Italian style. And they live in a pretty standard 1970s apartment block, but they have reasons to go to the ground, to see their neighbours and walk and have coffee, and they all go out in the evening and have their passeggiata, where they walk about and talk to each other and exchange news. It's a much, much healthier society than the one where we go inside and we don't come out and we spend our entire time in front of the screen. And that connection with nature so that we can have that fundamental thing that we need as humans, which is connection with the natural world. We are not out of it or separate from it, we are in it. So, Gawler. Really interesting story. I really enjoyed finding out more about Gawler. So, we have this town that gets, identified as being a place that Light feels is a viable place for settlement. It's got water, it's got some high ground, and it's a reasonable distance from Adelaide, far enough for it to start to be a connecting point for some of the other things that are happening around that region, and it's very early on. So 39, the survey was done, and it was to comprise 240 acres, and it was to be a mixed-use development. There was not going to be all of this stuff here, and a bit more of something else over there, and a bit of something over there. People lived and worked and had their recreation and did their social interaction, all in a fairly tight mix. And by the end of 1940, so very early on, there was one good inn, one public house, police barracks, 2 smith shops, 6 dwelling houses and 34 inhabitants. So in 12 months, they've made a pretty good bloody start, haven't they? Over the next 5 years, a number of general stores and blacksmith shops and a butcher were established, and various tradesmen had set up within the township. So you get this quick congregation and coalescence of people and activity, and it's drawn largely by the need to have transport links, but also the need for water. And again, we see that alignment with topography and working with the land rather than fighting it tooth and nail. And the plan of Gawler is recognised as quite far-reaching. The way Church Hill has been laid out is actually a really important piece of town planning. And it's, there's this very quick development of Gawler. It's considered one of the best examples of mid-19th century town planning in South Australia. it very quickly became the biggest settlement outside of Adelaide, and it also grew really quickly. So in the early 50s, we get, in fact, in 48 we get Williston being established, Gawler East in 49, Bertha. Sorry?
The other side of the station.
Thank you. 1950, and Evanston in 1953. So we're getting these little pockets of separate development. And again, they're not suburban sprawl, they're largely little self-contained communities, because even though they're close to Gawler, they're not close enough that you didn't need to be able to go and buy essentials and have a place to worship, educate kids. You know, that you did all that locally. So by 1948, the population in Gawler had grown to 300, with about 60 buildings located mainly along Murray Street in Churchill. And by 1851, the population had grown to over 1,000. There was a flour mill and 2 breweries, and Gawler was considered the key to the north. And so by 1950 and into the early 1900s, Gawler is absolutely booming. It's got a train connection to Adelaide, which means that even though originally it was having up to 100 bullock drays of copper ore come through, smelted copper, coming through from Burra, that rapidly was able to be transferred to the railhead that stopped it at Gawler. It was then a magnet for various manufacturing organisations, so we get the big foundries. They put the tram system in, which means that if you're doing a big engine at James Martin's foundry, you can actually take the larger, heavier sections to where they need to be using the tram tracks. It's an integrated development. They've thought of all the things they need to have a self-contained community. So there were flour mills, foundries, brickworks, manufacturing and retail, and it was considered the most industrialised town in Australia for a while. And then we get the rise of, especially post-World War II, we get the rise of private car ownership, and rural South Australia languishes. We get bigger and bigger farm machinery, we get, a greater ease to go outside of our communities to play sport, go to work, get an education, and a lot of our rural communities are struggling as a result. So we have this rapidly urbanising world. It's not just Australia, it's everywhere. And we are trying to respond to this because we know that really big cities are really unhealthy. Melbourne and Sydney are not the great meccas that they often claim to be. If you actually live there, they're not that much fun. So we have Gawler sitting up in the top blue ring up there, and it's one of the 3 big north of the city growth areas for housing all of these people that are going to flood our city and need to be housed at 2-point-something people per dwelling. And we talk about what we need to do to make this city work. So more housing in the right places, livable, accessible and inclusive communities. A strong economy built on a smarter, cleaner future. A greener, wilder, more climate-resistant environment. An integrated and connected region and coordinated delivery of land use and infrastructure planning. All great statements, really good stuff. So, in the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan document, the areas in pink are the ones that they've identified as really good opportunities for infill development. And for a lot of people, that scares the bejeebies out of everybody, because infill development in Australia is done at a pretty low bar. We don't adaptively reuse very well. We tend to demolish and rebuild, and what we replace the thing that we've pulled down with is usually a trifle disappointing. So we have a lot of nervousness about this, but in fact, if we go back to our American economist, if we can do that and do that well, we actually have a great outcome for our place. We will create a much more vibrant community by doing that, as opposed to this. So these are the areas around Gawler that are identified for greenfield housing. So this is productive farmland mainly. The bit down the bottom is possibly not getting a bit salty, but Concordia, which is the bit on the far side of the screen, is someone's farm, or was someone's farm. And instead of growing wheat and other crops, it's now going to grow houses. They're going to be poorly constructed on the main because we want them to be big, but we don't want them to be any more expensive than they have to be. So they are going to be, on average, they'll be about 3.5 to 4 stars because nobody actually measures to see if they meet 7. They're going to perform poorly. They're going to make the people in them either have to spend vast amounts of money keeping them heated and cooled, or they're going to make their inhabitants unwell. But apparently that's what Australians want. I'm not sure that a lot of Australians have much choice. So if you're a young person and you want to have a government subsidy, you have to go out and buy a new build. You can't get a subsidy unless you do that. And the only way to get the new build within the price cap is to go a long way out of the city. Concordia has no public transport, it has no roads, it has no water supply, it has no power, it has no sewers. It has nothing to recommend it. It has nothing from an employment point of view. It has no recreation facilities. It is just going to be trapped housing like you can see blossoming around Roseworthy and Two Wells. So we write all this wonderful stuff and then we do this because it's easy. And it's politically expedient. This is the transport infrastructure, and that's why I'm saying there is no transport planned for Concordia, because the government has said, no way. The train already comes into Gawler. After that, you're on your own. Private transport from there on, folks. So we've got Riverley Gardens, where actually the local residents have now set up a private bus service, because otherwise they can't get anywhere. They also have to truck their water in and truck their effluent out because they don't have connection to what we would consider to be pretty basic sanitation. The other concern is that's the projected employment lands that have been identified in the Greater Adelaide Regional Plan. And so unless you're a mountain goat or some kind of elite cyclist, you're driving your car to work. And so the cycle of car dependence and the amount of money that that takes to fund that dependence continues. So, as Rob said, there's lots of precedents in the world. You know, what if we didn't do this vomiting of houses over our landscape? What if we did something that actually was a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more considered? And yes, this will mean that we have to rethink what we think the Great Australian Dream is, but I would like to suggest to you that the Great Australian Dream has actually become a nightmare. And that really, if we want to have healthy, happy communities, then we need to rethink what it is that we want from our house. And if it's extra rooms so that we can store stuff that we might never use, that might not be a good enough reason to have the houses the size that we do. So we have, you know, it's basically where we started, but with some proper urban boundaries so that we don't just spew out all over everything. I remember there was a guy when we were kids, one of the local fruit and veg shops that we went to, and the man that used to serve us lamented the fact that they built all over the beautiful black soil of Campbelltown where they grew the best carrots. We also used to grow the best broccoli in the bit that's now under all of the tract housing at Mount Barker. And at a local level, instead of doing everybody gets their decreased block of land with their larger and larger house and the eaves that almost touch and the astroturf lawn at the back and the alfresco, and it's hot and it's hard. Maybe we could consider, if we don't really want to garden that much, we could consider living in something that looks a little bit more maybe European or like our earlier settlement models, because then we could actually free up some green space, which is, as I've said, is really good for us. And then we could have maybe a better standard of life. And because we're coming out of our houses to go to our green space, we're actually having that social interaction that we may not have now. And look, if you're a passionate gardener and you want to garden, go your hardest. But if you're going to buy a piece of land and basically pave it from one end to the other, then expect your community to be flood prone very soon. So, that is where I am going to leave you. Hopefully that has got you thinking a bit, and then you don't consider me to be an awful, unmitigated snob. But I think it is really important that we challenge ourselves and work out how we can achieve all the wonderful statements we have in these fundamental planning documents, and work out how we might achieve those before we carve up yet more arable land to grow houses. Thank you.
Okay, Robin Declare, if we could get you sitting at the front and...
I've got one.
Alright, so I'm going to give this to you two to share.
Yes, Adrian Shackley. I just wanted to do a little connection between our two speakers, or the history of it. I first got involved in Gawler in the late 1970s, and we had various heritage studies and things happening at the time. We also had a war on about demolition of historic buildings, which resulted in the formation of the Gawler Historic Building Preservation Society in 1980. There are still 4 of us here tonight who were involved at the time, which is pretty interesting. But arising out of that, well, first of all, in 1979, National Trust SA put together a proposal for the Register of the National Estate called the Gawler Conservation Area, which was essentially the original light plan for Gawler. And it was an excellent submission. It was accepted as an entry on the Register of the National Estate. It had a lot of clout, but it gave it sort of presence. There's a wonderful map that's hiding somewhere in the National Trust archives, which I dug up one stage when we were involved in all this disputation. But in 1985, a proposal came out for the Churchill State Heritage Area, which was sort of a bit disappointing in a way. I mean, because they really picked the eyes out of the old part of Gawler and said, well, let's have a really important area there, but ignore the rest. And I don't remember how it happened, but I was listening to ABC radio in 1985 and there was an interview with Rob Cheeseman. And I think it might have had something to do with Pat Harbison, who was one of their senior council representatives at the time, Israeli. But Rob was on there arguing that the light plan for Gawler should itself be a state heritage area rather than just this sort of small part in Churchill. I don't even remember why I was listening. Maybe our group knew what was happening.
I think it was Keith Conlon.
Could have well been Keith Conlon. Anyway, it was a wonderful interview. Rob did a great job. 1985. So we've been around a long time. But it didn't happen then. We lost out on that argument. But by 1998, we had a different heritage survey happen, and we ended up with a light historic conservation zone, which essentially covered, well, we had 3 sort of zones, but town centre and the Churchill and the light zone. Between the three of them, they constitute the original light plan for Gawler. So we actually got effectively a heritage zone in the town at that time. And partly driven by Michael Walsh, who was our town planner then. By the way, I noticed we don't have one town planner here tonight, which is very disappointing. We do have a couple of councils. Anyway, I thought that bit of history was really important. I mean, people love things in law and they stick to it. And with people like yourselves providing some expertise on that, that's fantastic because that's exactly what we need. So nobody have a question. I thought that was a useful piece of history.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's great though, Adrian, that you've demonstrated how important it is for people to value their place and to value it, because if people in an area don't actually, explain to people from outside that area why it's important and what it is that they want, then it's very easy for things to be lost.
I'd like to thank both speakers too. I think it was Robin that said we must ask ourselves what we can do. And I'd like both of you, if you wouldn't mind, commenting on that, because it seems to me that it's not us here sitting that are the problem. I think it's developers, and the fact that developers have the ear of government, and that is a really critical issue in this whole discussion.
Need about an hour for this. Well, Alec Ramsey and Tom Blayford, who was a left-wing Liberal, formed the Housing Trust, post-war, 1948. And they put together the idea that you needed to get a stack of land, put houses on it, and make it public housing. And by so doing, create a buffer of housing for younger people or people who couldn't afford housing to control the rents. Unlike our current federal government, which I think is spending $22 billion on a housing department, and they haven't built a house. Whereas Alec Ramsey said, we will build the houses, we will control the rent, and we will derive the capital gain from the houses we build. So the money was never lost. Now we're pouring it into a sink, then they didn't. Over the last several governments, we've watched, probably starting with the State Bank problem, $14 billion, the destruction of the housing trust. 150,000 houses have been taken down, sold on. So partly that was to cover a debt, but partly the pressure on the government from the Housing Industry Association, the Urban Development Institute, and the major broadacre housing developers have, through various means, and I won't use words like corruption, encouraged the government to dismantle public housing, saying we can do it better than you can. And in fact, they've proven that they can't. They've proven that they've taken control of the supply of housing, and they've controlled that supply so well that now no one young can afford a house. They've caused the prices to go up. Now, I don't have a problem with negative gearing, as we've seen it, only in as much as if negative gearing is used to speculate and to milk rents and control the supply, then it's a problem. If the government permitted negative gearing, in other words, mum and dad investors, to build houses with their own funds and create a form of public housing, if they wanted to derive a return on negative gearing, then they should be forced to control the rent and keep the rent low. Because they'll make their money up the capital gain anyway down the track, just like the government would if they built the houses themselves. But then the biggest problem outside of all of that is that we've got people actually doing physical planning of the future of the city, but they don't talk to the engineers in the transport department, and they don't talk to the land value, the value general's department. So people like Graham Goodman will be priced out of business. The food forest will go away because There'll be no endeavour to control the rating process. You'll be rated out of existence. So we've seen the vineyards that once existed near Bedford Industries, and then the vineyards at Brunella. They've been rated out of existence by a valuer general, people with clipboards and biros coming and going, this much per acre or whatever, therefore it'll be rented this much. And the poor farmer says, wow, that's increased my overheads to a point where I can't make the business stack up anymore. Oh well, we'll just have to subdivide and sell. So we have to get control of the Valuer General's department and the Transport department. We've got to pull them into one department with intelligent planners who understand land economics. This is what Bentham did, this is what Wakefield said. We haven't learned a bloody thing since they did that. And it's so simple.
I think it's, I always find Singapore interesting at this point. Singapore builds about 85% of the housing. The government builds about 85% of their housing. They're not known as a particularly socialist-leaning place, good old Singapore, but they know that if they want to attract people to keep fueling their economic growth, they need to give them housing. So the Housing Trust in South Australia was set up not as social housing, it was set up as key worker housing to attract people to come out to the new manufacturing centre of Elizabeth to build things, to make things. So we know in Australia that we don't have enough people, skilled people, to build more houses than we currently do. We're not attracting huge numbers of people to become carpenters and tilers and concreters, mainly because the culture is so broken in the housing sector, construction area. So we have in South Australia the capacity per year to build 8,000 to 10,000 houses max with our current model. So we're not going to meet those targets, those thousands and thousands of houses that we say we need. So we need to look at some alternative pathways. We need government to stop putting in, so they're going to put in $192 million into just putting pipes in the ground to open up land for development that might never happen. They will not have spent that money in a way that will guarantee the construction of a single home. Not one. Because that's all going to be left to the private sector. I think we would be much more responsible as a nation, because it costs us more to not house people than it does to house them. So if you're homeless, you actually cost society more than it would cost to actually provide you with a home. So let's provide people with homes. The private sector has more homes to build than it can service. Affordable housing is not in their wheelhouse. It's actually really hard to make money out of affordable housing, strangely. So why don't we say, okay, it's costing us as a society more to not house these people than to house them. We will go back to actually building things as a community, as a society, for people who need assistance to get into the market. And then we won't sell them on the open market. We will actually make sure that there's, just like the community-led development model in Victoria, the Nightingale model, we will say, okay, you've had this opportunity, but that means that when you sell it at some point in the future, you don't get to have whatever, the market is prepared to pay for that place. It remains affordable for the next generation and the generation after that. So there are things we can do to actually change that setting, and by doing that, by saying government will actually do some of the fundamental difficult parts that private industry can't really service well, then we actually have the chance to do other things like set up the core of these new areas for housing and for housing people, but also for giving them a community. We can actually do that in a much more meaningful way. We can also look at developing non-traditional construction techniques off-site construction techniques that are used all around the world, except for here, and which allow people different pathways into construction as a job and provide us different manufacturing opportunities, which as a country we are woefully low on. And we can make ourselves a much healthier, happy place.
Just on that, I think we are talking big government here, we're talking federal and state.
Just grab the microphone.
One of the concerns I have is they talk about federal and state governments. The key here is local government. You talk about alternative housing. How many local governments in South Australia allow tiny houses? Well, I think it's 2.
Tiny houses are not new.
No, they're not.
No.
And there are many alternatives, including off-site construction. The councils, local government, often don't allow those constructions to be in their space.
Okay, so since the new planning system came in, local government actually has a lot less say in all of those things. So yes, that was problematic. And the main reason we don't allow tiny houses in a lot of areas in Australia is because tiny houses are essentially caravans. And unless you can service them properly, we end up back in early settlement conditions where people, we've got a diphtheria epidemic happening at the moment in Australia, 200 and something cases, which is outrageously high for a developed country. But if we don't want to see typhoid and cholera, then we want to make sure that people actually have access to clean drinking water and an effluent system. And for a lot of people, that's the bit that doesn't get thought about in the tiny house. The size of the house is not the problem. It's the decoupling of thing you live in from an access to those services, developed world services, and that becomes problematic. But I think we are getting, there was a great initiative that got passed and it's being trialled in some places in Metro Adelaide and in, I think, Alexandrina Council picked it up as well. And it's called the Future Living Code Amendment, and it allows you to take a standard, character home, and instead of doing the barn of an addition on the back and the 3-car, 4-car garage with the pool house in the back garden, it says, why don't we say, okay, well, for the moment, we do have mum, dad and 2 kids and their friends that come around, and so we're going to have a house that suits that household for the moment, but it's going to be designed in a way that keeps the original house, allows 2 separate self-contained living units to be created at some stage when one of the kids is still at home, aged 35, and with a wife and 2 small children, and you really don't need to be looking after them 24/7. And the bit where the garage would have been is actually a 3rd single-bedroom house for, one of your single older friends who may not be able to access the housing market at the moment. So it actually looks at how we do the same amount of site coverage, keep existing character and existing landscape, and actually house 3 households on a piece of land that would normally be seen as a single household. And if we don't start doing that sort of thing, we're going to really, really, have a big struggle.
But that then comes back down to that council, that particular council is progressive.
Yep.
1 council out of 78?
5.
5. Okay.
So 5 have picked it up initially. I think it'll take a little bit of time for people to explore those opportunities, but this basically allows you to do, they don't have to be that tiny. You could do 3 compact houses on a standard suburban block. Not one of the new, we need to make it affordable, so we'll make it the size of a postage stamp, but in a character area, and it's designed to retain character homes. So it's dealing, it's appealing to a certain part of the market. and certain parts of existing cities and towns, but it is another option. And it's, you know, it's important we consider all the options and not just the easy ones.
Just adding to that, my spirit for the Housing Trust, again, I did a lot of work with the Housing Trust during the 80s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And we experimented with house blocks of 120 square metres. That's getting pretty small. In fact, we won a national competition for a fairly intense housing development, which was called Sheldon Street in Norwood. No one's ever complained about that development when we have blocks of land, 120 square metres, with little L-shaped blocks, lot line housing. I mean, we have wasted so much land in Australia with this idea that we block of land, you stick the house, and then we have leftover space on the sides, and we build roads, sewers, infrastructure with all of that extra land. So now we're turning the blocks out away, now we're putting, we still have a bit of space left on the side. But in the Housing Trust developments, we were able to experiment with different house types so that the Housing Trust tenants became guinea pigs, I guess, for new ideas. And some really good ideas came out of the Trust during the 80s. Some of those best people that we had disappeared from here, went to Perth and then went to Queensland. And we lost our best brains. And eventually as they left, and as the socially concerned enthusiasm of the Housing Trust was watered down by big private development operations influencing government, then we've lost all of that. I don't know how we get it back. I seriously don't know how we get it back. I would have thought that an intelligent Premier with an absolute mandate to govern for 2 terms should just bite the bullet and try to understand this and actually start doing it, because no one is in a position to complain, and we could get it so quickly. We could even get a concert hall, you know, and no one would blink about $500 million for a concert hall, because in the $100 billion debt we're running up, it's just a blink. So if you're running up debt, let's get on with it and do it this way and demonstrate how we can do it. I don't know. I think we just haven't got the courage to have a go anymore. And we have people who, I won't say more about How about it? But on the tiny house thing, yeah, I think tiny houses are great. But I guess what councils don't want is trailer parks of the United States, or people living in caravans and parking lots. And we've got all kinds of choice now for houses. We have to be careful, because there's a 28-storey building just got approval for Franklin Street in the city, where all of the houses in that apartment building will come completely finished from China in containers, lifted up by crane, slotted in, all of the fit-outs, and they've got all their furniture in them, and all they have to do is plug in the electricity and the water and the sewer in the frame of the building that goes up, and that's all of those trades are gone from South Australia. We don't need them. And this is because the Housing Industry Association has protected a current form of housing and the trades associated with that, and denied a change in technology. The conservatism in that, the conservatism is everywhere. It's within governments, within the housing providers, the lot, even the architects. So, sorry, I'm not going to help you very much with positive words.
We do have a couple of fantastic proposals for tiny houses. One was developed by an architectural practice called Studio 9 in conjunction with a social organisation called Forage Built, I think. Anyway, Forage is either the name of the housing model or the name of the provider, but they are looking at ways in which they can put these very beautifully designed small individual dwellings for people who are currently suffering homelessness. And the model isn't just, again, it's a bit like the systematic colonisation. It's not just about a physical thing, it's about support services and training and psychological and mental health and physical health services all being provided to what essentially becomes a small community. The proposal is that, because land is so expensive, is that vacant blocks within our existing city would be used on a short-term basis, and that because these things are small and transportable, when that block has a viable development opportunity, that comes to fruition, you can pick them all up and move them on to the next one. The vacant land bill that was proposed by the Greens about 3 years ago finally got re-looked at by the Upper House about a year ago, and the Institute of Architects lobbied strongly for that to be passed. And we were told that it was not possible to pass that bill because it would remove developable land from the market, and it would be an inappropriate thing to do given that there was a housing affordability and supply crisis. If you read the bill, it's about a defined lease of the land. So instead of compulsory acquisition, it's a compulsory lease of land that has been undeveloped for extended periods of time, and that there is a trigger that means that within a 3-month period the site would be cleared and returned to the owner if they had a viable and realistic and approved development opportunity. And in the meantime, while they're not letting the site become unsightly, unsafe, full of vermin, dusty in the summer, lowering the value and the amenity of the area in which those sites are located, the site would be the landscape for public use or used for temporary emergency housing. And while that is happening, you've got services connected. If you plant a tree, growing a tree on a piece of land that is potentially contaminated, and if we're looking at land within our existing city, most of them are, then it actually starts to break down those contaminants and remediate soil. So by the time the developer gets their bit of land back, it's in much better nick than it was.
I was just thinking of the corny side of it all.
Well, eventually, at the last, minute, they finally put some bloody grass on it and used it for a few things. But there's a site on Butcher Street in Adelaide that sat there, growing weeds and, being dusty and unpleasant. It's been there for decades. Oh, no, we can't possibly do something that would lift the amenity of that part of the city and potentially house some people, because the people who own that land might get their feelings hurt. How very sad.
Okay, we've got a question down here.
Oh man, I've got so many questions. First, you kind of covered this, but I wonder if you could flesh it out a little bit more. I feel there's an inherent conflict between heritage and infill. It was quite interesting, Professor Cheeseman, when you opened up your talk, you mentioned that Adelaide stayed true to the containment of a city bounded by parklands. We wouldn't necessarily see a city with any heritage at all today, because it would have been destroyed, constantly knocked down, rebuilt and repurposed over the course of the century in order to grow its population base. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
I'm not sure whether Nicolette and I would agree on all aspects of heritage. I won't even go. But Adelaide, the beauty of Adelaide as a planned city is that all that was planned was the base infrastructure, the framework, the bones of the city. No one said there's a height limit. No one said you can only have residential here and you've got to put industrial there. The idea of polarised land uses never existed when that happened. The polarisation of land uses in planning and zoning systems, now written into law, is a child of the 1940s. It's barely old at all. It's only 80 years old. We never had polarisation like that before. The idea that all the industry goes there because the prevailing winds blow it that way. So I think we're overplanned. I think we need infrastructure, we need more diversity, more understanding of diversity. If there's a problem with an industry next door to your house, It's not that it's the industry next door to the house, it may be the pollutant or the noise. So put the industry there, but make sure it's not offensive. So incorporate inoffensive or the mechanisms required to make it inoffensive into the cost of the industry. So often it comes back to an economic solution. And when the economic solution becomes unpalatable, then it's turned into a political solution. And that's when it's all about getting votes and who gives a damn about the future. I'm sorry, but I'm actually cynical about democratic systems. I think democracy is the very thing that's going to destroy all of us within, 10,000 years? We'll all be gone off the face of it. So, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible cynic.
Give the microphone to me, people think that. So I think that's a very interesting thing to say, that you can't have development unless you have, or we can't have a healthy and well-designed population unless you demolish everything that is old, because clearly old things, you can't do anything with them. That is absolutely fundamentally not true. Buildings are amazing resilient structures. So post-war, my dad lived in Genoa, and I went back luckily in 2014 to have, to see where my dad spent time once he finally got out of 3 years waiting not to die of TB in a sanatorium. Had a great life. And the number of people that still live in the old part of Genoa is huge. It's not all tourists and, short-term rental. People actually live there. It's their home. They come and do their shopping there. There was a bar across the road from where we stayed that sounded like they were having the best time on the planet at 3 o'clock in the morning. That was a bit hard to take. But, there are thriving communities in old cities. You don't have to knock everything down to have...
Can I ask you a question?
To have...
My question to you, Nicola, is how can we change the rating system so that heritage buildings, or people in buildings that have been given heritage value, aren't rated to a point where they can't actually make the business work that they're in? Surely we have to go back to urban economics or land economics and then get control of the valuation and rating systems if we want to keep your buildings.
I like the fact that I'm fine with
Well, tell them how many you've got to look after. 85?
82 properties.
And how many are there in Tasmania?
11. Anyway, looking after old buildings is expensive. However, when we look at, and it's not just old, it's office buildings that have reached the end of their service life, as offices. We need to be more thoughtful about the way we use our structures. This idea that buildings are somehow disposable commodities is killing us. 8% of our carbon footprint comes from concrete alone in the world.
I just want to add a bit of spice to that. I feel like a lot of the demolition work was done in the 60s and 70s because a lot of the buildings that we appreciated as heritage now were only 30 years old at the time. And I think we demolished things prior to them becoming valued as heritage. And that's what I mean about Adelaide's city not having developed heritage characteristics if it was true to its plan, because things would have been recycled before they gained that sense of old provenance, that sense of character that we find find the charm of old things today. We love housing, we love Victorian era housing, villa housing and stuff, but we don't necessarily appreciate 70s housing right now, even though there's a lot of charm in 70s housing, and we're demolishing those. So, and again, this comes back to that inherent conflict of infill. And then that is always compromise, and it's not a simple black and white, and that's why democracy doesn't work, because it's not black and white.
I'm not ageist about our buildings. I don't think that they need to be a certain, made of a certain material or of a certain age. I think there is actually enormous value in 1970s houses, personally. And but try to keep every building is not necessarily, realistic either. Some of the development we've done over the span of our post-colonial history and occupation of this place is rubbish. We are now building things that might have a serviceable lifespan, given the rate of climate change and the dreadful parlous way they're constructed. They might have a 10 to 15 year lifespan if we're lucky. We can't keep doing this. We need to be more sustainable. In fact, we need to be better than sustainable. If I told you that your relationship was sustainable, you'd probably go, oh, that doesn't sound very good. We need to actually be actively doing good. We need to actively be repairing our world. And that is going to mean that we have to make some difficult decisions. Otherwise, we've got a whole lot of housing that apparently is going to be built at Dry Creek, and I don't care how much dirt they pile on that site is always going to be prone to flooding. They'll have to build a bloody great mountain for it not to be. And maybe we should just put a whole lot of duck boards out there and some pontoons, and we could build a whole lot of, we could build a marina. So, and then we wouldn't have to put all the dirt there. But we need to be better. We need to actually think beyond what the mass housing market tells us we have to have, which is pretty low grade, and actually look at what we need in a much more thoughtful manner.
Could I just ask a question which goes across to the parkland kind of concept, which we are very interested in at the moment, with the Northern Parkland sort of currently being planned. What are the hallmarks of good parklands, functional parklands, and how should they be run, and what would be the kind of goals that you would be setting? You were setting up a fantastic Northern Parkland today.
Graham.
Sorry.
Question. Well, why don't we just start by defining all of the drainage lines and give them a purpose and make them the most beautiful linear parks you can imagine. Every river, every creek. And just mark them out in green on the map and say, no development. And then suddenly you could link to those bikeways. And you just come back from there, and then you start looking at transport, other means of transport. How do you link people to those? To me, it's a very simple thing to go over the whole of a vast area of metropolitan Adelaide and just map it out with basically landscape and topographical constraints. And then within that, how much of that can remain as agricultural or rural? I did a scheme in a previous practice I had for rural housing. So we did a scheme for a 30-house development near Parawa, down off the Range Road, on about 150 acres. But we constrained the houses to a very tight area with its own effluent system, its own water system, its own vegetable garden area, and then obviously adjustment areas beyond that for stock, sheep and natural areas. I did another scheme outside of Woodside where, we said, well, if this idea of that Nicolette's talking about can be, Woodside could be a rural community centre, and you don't want to sprawl the housing out, well then just go over to the next valley. There's an old farm over there and some outbuildings. And around that, create fairly intense, two-storey, if you like, housing, 30 or so houses in a community. How do the children in that community get to school? They go to Woodside. They bus just over the hill, 10, 15-minute drive. So you do these pockets of consolidation. And through that, you start to you have the green spaces in between. Some of it's privately owned, some of it has community access. This to me is just such a simple way to design, and it's existed for so long. Patrick Geddes talked about it 200 years ago, for God's sake. I don't know, it's just that this pervasive influence of of private development on a large scale, aided and abetted by a land valuation system, aided and abetted by, listen to this one, Graham, lawyers, who scare the shit out of us because we're going to be sued. And they scare the insurers, so they put the insurance up. And all these things start to act against the conservation of heritage areas. We've just gone crazy. You know, we've allowed this whole network. It's a sort of a mafia, isn't it? It's got us so controlled that the politicians don't know how to pull out of it and do something sensible. This is very depressing, isn't it? I have to. What's that?
I want more of this.
So, you know, people go to parks for all sorts of different reasons. So I think the key to great green space is variety. I love going through the parklands of Adelaide. I think it's great. You see, you know, I'd drop my kids off so that they could do soccer practice and I'd be able to walk by the torrents, and there are parts of my walk where I would think I could have been anywhere out in the country. And then there are other people with their kids and they're exploring and playing and using equipment, and there are people on the Torrens Lake paddling about, and there are other people having a picnic. We all want to interact with things in different ways. We need to, I think, as a community, value that more. But, you know, I think the key to great green space is giving people choice. But I do like the idea of concentrating that green space around watercourses, because even if they're only winter watercourses, water is fascinating stuff. And, you know, if you have that connection between the green space and the water, and then they all tend to connect up, which is really wonderful. So then you encourage biodiversity, because again, where you've got water, you've got things that sustain life. So you actually end up doing the things that we desperately need to do as we increasingly urbanise our world. And it was great the other day when I came out of my street in the wood, and straight across from me in the parklands, Western Parklands, was a kangaroo sitting there looking me dead in the eye, going, yeah, not bad. Haven't done too badly with this place. And the fact that we can actually have koalas, kangaroos, possums, make me a little bit twitchy because they keep getting all of our plants, but you know, the fact that we can actually have the ability to have that level of natural fauna in our city, I think is really great.
Just quickly, that 1984 I was engaged by the District Council of Yankalilla to do a master plan such as I just described for the whole of the bottom end of the Fleurieu. And I did. I was in partnership with a horticulturalist and a planner and a landscape architect. So we had an environmental design practice, which we had an office in Melbourne, one in Adelaide. And the scheme, I showed them how they could have up to 5,000 people living in Jervis. And they didn't need to connect Normanville with Yankalilla, but they could keep the open space in between. And similarly, they could treat Second Valley differently and so on. They thought I was mad because it involved growing the towns by tightening up and increasing the density. And I'm not talking anything more than 3 stories, but generally 2 stories. But lot line housing, all that sort of thing, and mix it up with, as Nicolette was showing us in some of her images, the more commercial infrastructure. They seriously thought I was mad. We did another scheme for Wollonga, a heritage scheme. We got a grant from National Heritage. And we said, look, you don't need upstand curbs. Yeah, bitumen's fine, but how about some just simple open swales along the side of the street? This is 1982. Along the side of the street, St. Peter Street, or whatever, I've forgotten the names of the streets now. And they said, what about street trees? Yeah, well, we said, okay, we'll do a survey on the houses where we've got some nice geraniums along here, and a nice little crimped wire fence. We'll keep that nicely open. Here we can put some vines in the street. We'll plant some fruit trees here. Here we put a couple of camaldulensis here because it's really on the edge of a drainage line. And they said, "You daft, fruit trees in the street? What if people slip on the fruit?" And so they ran us out of town, and we actually could have got that whole scheme done with it for half the money they got from National Heritage. We could have had it all done and dusted. They ran us out of town, lost the money, and then one of the councillors said, "Listen to me, boys. I've got a nursery up on the top of the hill, top of Wollonga Hill. You might even know his name. We need natives in the street." Because they said to me, "We need natives." Oh, I said, "You need natives? Okay, well, first of all, get rid of all the houses, get rid of the people, bring the Aborigines back, and make sure you only plant the species that are indigenous to the Wollonga area. Don't put stuff from Western Australia in there."
Queensland
Or
pops.
Queensland, yeah, all this sort of stuff. But you daft, they said. Anyway, you go down there today and you've got eucalyptus up and down the streets, planted exact distances apart, they really ordered eucalyptus, not scraggly things all over the place. Oh my God, we've gone mad.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it here, but I'm sure Rob and Nicolette would be happy to stick around for a few minutes if anyone wanted to come up and chat to them. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Would you just join with me as we thank Rob and Nicolette? So thank you for coming. Please help yourself to some refreshments before you leave if you'd like. We appreciate you being here and safe travels back to home. Thank you.